Thank you for coming. We do have a whole lot that went on in the legislative session. There has not been a favorable gun bill passed in the state of Georgia in 3 years. The last success, our own Mitch Seabaugh was the author, Senate Bill 308. You might remember we finally repealed the 140-year-old public gathering law, which said in Georgia that if you go to any of this list of 6 places, including but not limited to, that's a public gathering, or brought it to or kept it in the parking lot, or the case law said up to 200 yards away off the premises, you could go to jail, and people did go to jail, and that's why there was case law. So that law is gone. Unfortunately, we've kept a lot of the places from the public gathering law in the Georgia Code. And so Georgia Carry has been active in wanting to remove some of those, and basically the mission is restoring Georgia's right to bear arms. And the reason is because we view the right to bear arms as a fundamental human right, regardless of what the Constitution has to say on the matter. And with respect to that, those of you who heard me last week on Armed American Radio, forgive me for repeating this, but I just want to say let's look at the language. If we substituted some more mundane things than arms and weapons that everybody gets up in arms about. What if there was a constitutional amendment that said a well-educated electorate being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and read books shall not be infringed. Now you see I only switched a couple of words. A well-educated electorate being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and read books shall not be infringed. Now we all know, we're told constantly, our teachers told us growing up, judges tell us, politicians tell us constantly, all rights are subject to reasonable restrictions. So let's examine that. What would be the reasonable restrictions on this constitutional right I just laid out? Would you have to be well educated in order to keep and read books, under penalty of going to jail if you're not well educated enough and you're caught with a book? Would you have to be a registered voter? Says a well-educated electorate. Maybe a well-educated registered voter in order to keep and read books. Could you bring a book to church? Could there be a law? Would that be a reasonable restriction saying you cannot bring a book into church? You can't bring a book into a government building. Can't bring a book down to the General Assembly to meet with your representative or senator. Would the government be able to restrict the types of books you read? Some have messages that are too dangerous. They give you subversive thoughts about government and wanting to cut it back and restrict it. Could you read these books back here on this table? Would books be accessible to minors? Throw up your hand if you can think of a restriction that would be acceptable under that constitutional amendment. But we substitute the words militia and arms, and all of a sudden we have basically all of those things that there are huge numbers of people out there that would advocate that these are reasonable restrictions. And some of those I pointed out that are just a part of Georgia law. And mainly these things show up in the news because we have this perception that there are a lot of mass shootings going on. Does everybody here have that perception? I'd like to just point, because somebody went and ran the numbers, and Rachel Maddow, are any of you familiar with her? MSNBC, I know you all are probably faithful watchers, right? She said on TV, if you've been thinking we live in an era that is more marked by this type of mass bloodshed than any era before, I'm sad to tell you, you are right. It did not used to be this way, but more and more, this is part of how we live. Well, what's actually happening is it's a perception because of people like Rachel Maddow who run these things constantly. The fact is it's not true. She used the definition of 12 or more victims being killed and said it's increased, because if you make that cutoff 12, then you find that half of them are recently, and the other half going back to 1949 were spread out, and therefore we could say there's been this huge increase. Well, if you make the cut point different, like let's say make it 14. Somebody ran the numbers. If at least 14 victims died, then the shootings like that were nearly twice as high in the 25 years between 1966 and 1991 than in the years since 1991. If you make the cutoff where the FBI says it is, which is 4 people, and there were about 600 of those from 1980 to 2010, then the frequency of those sort of mass shootings does not appear to have changed over the years. So be careful what you're seeing on the news. You know, when I was a police officer, you heard that in my bio, I used to turn on the news and the news would be focusing on a chase. Well, there's this chase in the downtown connector going on, and everybody watching that is like, that is the one chase in Atlanta, you know, today. And one day when I turned that on, I had been in 4 chases the night before. 4 in one shift, okay? So, you know, be careful of having your perception shaped by the news. Now, I'll tell you another statistic that doesn't appear in there, but a guy by the name of John Lott, is everybody familiar with him? He's done a lot of studies with a professor at Georgia UGA called Professor Mustard on the use of firearms and its effect on crime. And what he has found is that in every one of those shootings, where it was a mass shooting, it was a place where guns were restricted either by law or by the owner's preference on not wanting firearms at that location. Every one of them. And the reason is, these people who go in to do that sort of thing, they're not looking, they're not looking to go in and get into a fight. They look for places where people are defenseless. They look for schools. They look for churches. And we've seen examples where they go to a school or church and don't find what they expect. You know, everybody talks about Virginia Tech, for example, but does anybody talk about the Appalachian Law School? Raise your hand if you're even familiar with a mass shooting at the Appalachian Law School. Got one in the entire room. 5 years before Virginia Tech, there was a mass shooting at the Appalachian Law School. Same state. A guy came in, he shot 3 people before 2 students with firearms, because it's not actually illegal to carry firearms to class in Virginia. Virginia Tech just banned them as a school policy. 2 students with firearms stopped the mass shooting after 3 deaths. Now I want to give you another statistics. In mass shootings where the police stop the shooting, there's an average of 18 people killed. In shootings where a person who is not a police officer with a gun stops the shooting, the average is 3. And that's exactly what happened at the Appalachian Law School. The 2 students stopped him. Somehow police officers who arrived at the scene were not confused as to who the bad guy was and who the good guys were, which is what we always hear. You've heard a police officer say that on the news, I'm sure. They weren't confused. I've been to scenes where good guys had a gun and were holding people at gunpoint. I was never confused. Next time you hear a chief say that, tell him you ought to have a little more faith in his officers than that, because I've never seen it happen. But they stopped the shooting, and the AP carried a story. The AP is the wire that runs out to all these news organizations, that 2 students tackled him, and they didn't mention the guns. And John Lott, whom I mentioned earlier, he has a book called The Media Bias Against Guns. And he goes into great detail about this one event, as well as many other studies on firearms in the news. But in this one event, he went and talked to the reporter, he talked to the 2 students who used the firearms, and he talked to the editor who ran the original story. The 2 students said, yeah, we told the reporter that we pulled out our guns and we threatened the guy, and he stopped immediately, because that's what they always do. As soon as there's a gun present, they stop. And so what does she write? They tackled him. The editor said, well, we didn't think that the gun angle was important. Do you believe that? So the fact is, you hear more about the mass shootings where there was no gun available, like the Navy Yard shooting, where we have trained warriors who are left helpless and defenseless and running around. Their only option to run and hide, beg for mercy, or offer up their body as some sort of sacrifice, like the 3 adults at the Newtown, Connecticut school who tried to stop the shooting, and all they did was end up shot, which I think is immoral and reprehensible, that we leave people with nothing but their courage and despair at our schools. So with that, I want to turn to the legislative session. As I said, 3 years now we've been essentially skunked, and that's not to say that we haven't had some people working hard on some of these issues. We have, but there's been a lot of monkey business going on. This year, the hot political topic is college campus carry. Now, to hear these people discussing it up there, you wouldn't think that almost half the states now have no law against carrying a firearm on a college campus. Even the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act, passed by Democrats, doesn't mention college campuses. It applies to K through 12 only, and there is a blanket exception in the federal law if you have a firearms license from the state in which you live. Blanket exception. There's no federal law that applies to you carrying in a school. In Georgia, we've had some changes to the school law. It's been reduced from this 1,000-foot zone, and there was an exception put in to allow you to keep a gun locked in your car if you had to go into a school for some reason other than picking up a child. Because the way the old law read, you could have a gun while carrying or picking up a student. Didn't say it had to be in the car, but the moment you diverted to do something else, parent-teacher conference or read a book to your child's classroom, as I used to do with some regularity, you were committing a felony by leaving the gun behind in your car. And that wasn't fair, so we asked the General Assembly if they weren't willing to just get rid of that silly law, then at least make an additional exception for locking a gun in your car. And yet, what do I get this week from my son's school but a parent handbook with policies they've asked us to agree to? It says it's illegal to have a gun in your car in a school parking lot. And that's right here in Coweta County, okay? So we've got things on the home front as well as the General Assembly. But with colleges, it's been a hot potato. The Board of Regents is out fighting very hard. They have a lot of political clout. Now, I'll remind you that 4 years ago, they were fighting having guns in the parking lots of college campuses too, but now they're coming out and they're telling these politicians, hey, we're okay with the law the way it is now. Well, you know, of course they are. 4 years later, we're sitting here looking back, and the only effect of having guns in parking lots at colleges is we don't read about carjackings in college parking lots anymore, which used to happen. Okay? But what we do have going on, first 2 weeks of this session, we had 4 armed robberies of students. First 2 weeks. This week, excuse me, last 2 weeks, we've had a stabbing, we've had a shooting, we've had a rape, and we've had more than one armed robbery of Georgia college students. Now, in some cases, these are going to be people who are younger than 21 and couldn't get a license anyway. But I can tell you right now, because I have an acquaintance of mine who was in an attempted carjacking, a college student. He literally had taken his final exams that day, went out to Conyers, and stopped in the parking lot of, I believe it's Ingalls, to get some items for some friends. They were having a little party to celebrate the end of the school year. This is a guy who cannot carry on a college campus, but he steps out of his car. 2 guys approached him. One grabs him from behind, actually put a knife to his neck and started cutting when he pulled his gun and shoved the guy off and shot him. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. Killed him. Guy's dead right there in the parking lot. So he's in a crowded parking lot with other people, somehow manages to shoot the correct person. The police arrive. They're not confused as to who the bad guy is or who the good guy is. And he survived. He had some stitches in his neck, and that was it. But yet, we're going to tell this guy, you were not qualified or competent or mature enough, all these arguments we hear, to carry on a college campus. The moment he crosses this magical boundary line onto the college campus, somehow he's going to kill other students, he's going to shoot his teacher over bad grades, and on and on and on. Now, what is going to prevent a student now from shooting his teacher over bad grades, if that's what the student wants to do? In fact, if anything, he's going to have an open field to go and do that the way Georgia colleges are set up now. Do you hear about those sorts of things in Colorado or Utah? You know, we had a college president, and I'm embarrassed to say that I forget, I think it's Georgia Tech, who was down at the Capitol opposing college carry for the reason that all of these terrible things were going to happen. And the simple question to ask him was, well, wait a second, you were a chancellor at the University of Colorado. What happened there? Tell us about your experience with guns on campus there. And in fact, we did ask him that, and he responded, well, it's just a different environment. There's a lot of different things here in Georgia. I don't know what's wrong with us Georgia folks that he couldn't get that. But the fact is, we have, with 50 states, it's like a large laboratory out there, and you can see what's going on. And I will tell you that Georgia is not very high up in the list of states with no places off limits. Everybody likes to think, well, we're a Second Amendment friendly state. When Georgia Carry started its mission, this state had more places off limits to the carry of firearms than any other state in the nation. The only exception to that is Illinois, because Illinois at the time did not permit any carry of firearms, although they just passed a law this year after being forced by a court to do so, or just have all their laws stricken down. But still, today, as I stand before you, Georgia has more places off limits to carrying a gun than California. California. And yes, you can point to all sorts of silly laws they have in California about magazine restrictions and this sort of thing. And in some counties, it's very difficult to get a firearms license. But I've run the numbers for every county in California, and you know something? There are counties in California that have a higher issuance rate than the average in Georgia. And that license is good no matter where you go in the state. And that license lets you carry into your child's elementary school classroom in California. It lets you carry onto a college campus. It lets you carry into the Capitol building. It lets you carry into the governor's mansion. The governor's mansion law says it's illegal to carry a firearm unless you are the governor, a member of the governor's family, a police officer, or the holder of a California firearms license. Now, what do you think about that, Georgian? The other big issues that are going on in the General Assembly today are churches, and I'm just going to pause there for a second. Churches. How many states in the country categorically bar firearms from places of worship like Georgia does? Raise your hand if you think you know. Somebody. Nobody. 20, 30, what do you think?
15.
15? 3. Georgia's one of them. Georgia, Mississippi, and North Dakota are the only states in the nation that categorically bar firearms from churches. And yet, to hear some of the people who are against that change in Georgia law speak, you would think we were just doing something outlandish and unique. It was kind of like airports when we had the mass transit issue going on. You might remember it used to be 20 years in prison, a felony even to have a gun in the parking lot at the airport. When that law changed, Georgia was the 41st state to get rid of a law on carrying guns in airports. In other words, there were extremely few states that even had a restriction like that, and yet we weren't hearing about all these terrible things happening at airport. By the way, California was one of those states that had no restriction on carrying in the airport. And of course, since that has happened, do we have any of the things people predicted happening in the airports? I'll tell you, I ran the numbers on MARTA, and armed robbery, aggravated assault, rape, these are all things that happen on MARTA, unfortunately, and murder, which is extremely rare on MARTA, so it didn't really factor into the numbers. But all of those other things went down every year since the mass transit law was changed so that you could carry a firearm. Now, I don't know that it caused it, but certainly there's a correlation there, and you can't claim that having more guns there increased the level of violence or crime. And, not all violence is bad, okay? If a woman shoots a rapist, yes, that is violent, but that's not a bad thing, and it's not a bad issue to have in public policy. But with churches, what's going on in the General Assembly now, and I'll tell you to look up these two bills, except that you're not going to find the current versions on the website, and I don't know why that is, and I wish somebody would change it. But House Bill 512 and Senate Bill 101 are the two bills that are kind of out there. They both need to have work done to them. Georgia Carry is pushing quite hard for House Bill 512. It has passed the House, it's sitting in the Senate. Senate Bill 101 started out as a somewhat more unrelated bill. It came back to the House, had a lot of the provisions from House Bill 512 put into it. The general lay of the land on both of those bills is that they will repeal the restriction on carrying on college campuses, with some issues about dorms and some other things like that. And I hesitate to get too detailed on it simply because I don't know what this is going to look like when January comes. But essentially both of those bills would repeal the restriction on carrying on college campuses for licensed carriers. In other words, you're talking about people who are 21, they've been through the FBI and local background checks, they've been fingerprinted. It's not going to be most college students, but it's going to be enough to cause somebody who wants to do people harm to question, is this student going to be my target or not? It would repeal the restriction on carrying in churches. It would repeal the restriction on carrying in government buildings. However, that has been subject to huge changes. One of them is courtrooms. Basically, the original version of the bill said, if you want to restrict a gun from a government building, then you need to have metal detectors and people screening so we can be assured that somebody with bad intent isn't coming in there. If you're being asked to give up your gun, you ought to at least have that level of safety. Well, judges came down and said, hey, not all of our courthouses are secure. We don't have metal detectors at our courthouse down in this county, and we're concerned somebody might come in with a gun. Well, does that make sense? What's stopping somebody from coming into your courthouse with a gun now? So, we'd like to see that. Generally speaking, courthouses have been pulled out of both versions of those bills. However, I would point out there are courthouses, the definition of what would be a courthouse under the law, there are courthouses everywhere that you might not think are courthouses. There are little administrative law courts, sometimes even in privately owned buildings. So we would like to get rid of the gotchas in the law, and we would certainly like to get rid of any mention of any private property being off limits as a matter of criminal law. That should be up to a property owner. Whether the property owner is a church or any other property, leave that to private property rights, and not something that somebody risks a criminal law violation because they thought they had notice from somebody who turned out not to be the right person, or somebody changes their story later about what that permission was. I would like to go ahead and, I meant to keep track of the time, Brant, but I'd like to go ahead and open.
22 minutes, we got about 10 minutes for questions.
I'm going to open the floor to questions, and feel free to ask me anything you like, either about Georgia Carry's mission or what we are trying to do in the General Assembly this year, and I'll be happy to talk about it. Mr. Camp, yes, sir.
Ed, do you know the people who are objecting at the House and the Senate, so that we can target those people specifically and write them a letter, give them a call or whatever to say, look, we're really encouraging you to support.
I would tell you to encourage all of them, especially on the committees that are looking at these sorts of things. I could name a few names. I don't think I'm going to. Some of them aren't even in the Senate anymore because they're off running other see somebody shaking his head over here who knows. Because they're off running other campaigns. I will say that there has been, with more time to look at this issue, many of the politicians in the Senate and the House are taking very close looks at these bills and figuring out what the problems are. We're, of course, trying to help with that. For example, one of the bills added a training requirement for students who are 21 to 25 wanting to carry on campus. Georgia Carry does not support training burdens in the law to exercise a constitutional right. I'm all for training. I sat through an 8-hour training course Sunday, which, by the way, I'd like to mention just for a little bit, but I've had week-long training where they hand out ammunition in buckets. I love training. I think everybody should get training, but I don't think that you should impose training as a burden upon somebody applying for a license. And the reason is, it's a burden on the exercise of constitutional right. Just philosophically, I'm opposed to that. And B, the only effect I've seen with training requirements, and About half the states have them, about half don't. Again, it's like a big laboratory. You can look and see what the effect is. The only effect, it doesn't change safety, it doesn't change mistaken shootings. The only thing it changes is the number of people who have firearms licenses. And John Lott, again running the numbers, says that has a negative effect on public safety. So I believe training actually has requiring training as part of a licensing process actually has a negative effect on public safety. But politicians are looking at that because we don't want to see training sneaking in. First it's going to be 21 to 25, and I'll tell you what, there were already senators pushing for training for everybody as part of that bill last year, and we've got a senator here shaking his head to confirm it. That was going on behind closed doors. They were trying to do that. So I would just urge you to push everybody, especially people who are conferees on the Senate Bill 101 Conference Committee report. And I'd urge you to take a look at House Bill 512. Is that sitting in Judiciary, or has it been assigned?
Non-civil.
Judiciary non-civil. So I would urge you to contact the members of Judiciary non-civil. Remember, that was passed out of the House. It needs a little work, but it is much closer to the goals that we'd be seeking than 101 is. So I would urge you to contact the members of Judiciary non-civil. Yes, ma'am.
When will the final version of 512 be ready? Did you say, because you're saying that what they have up on the website right now is just really not indicative?
Well, I don't know what's going on with the websites. If you look at Senate Bill 101, in fact, the Conference Committee report isn't there. So that's a separate issue. And I can't answer that because I don't, for the life of me, know why it's not instantaneously available on the web, but we're 6 months later and it's still not there. So yeah, somebody down there I'm hoping could address that. It's kind of like, you know, we can't see anybody past the first 5 co-sponsors of a bill on a website either. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I just recently read an article in regards to school policy, and one of the northern counties or school system is going to put a long rifle in the school for access by the school resource officer. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a step in the right direction. I would prefer to see the school restriction removed, and teachers who want to, I don't want to see any teacher forced to carry a firearm, but teachers who want to discreetly carry a firearm in schools to make sure that if something like Newtown were to happen, there would be somebody who could do something other than just hide with the kids and shield them with their body while some crazy person shot the students. I mean, let's take a look at the Newtown situation. They had the buzzer thing. Did you all see that Fulton County is spending a whole bunch of money from their special local option sales tax to install buzzer doors? You know, they had one of those in Newtown, Connecticut, right?
What's a buzzer door?
Where it's locked and they've got to buzz you in. He just walked up and shot the door and went on in. You know, I don't like to see ineffective use of money like that, but those who are prepared and willing and able to do so, we obviously had teachers even in Newtown who were all of those things except prepared, because the law there makes sure they are not prepared to be able to protect those students. And we can't count on every crazy person not really being determined, like the guy in DeKalb who walked in and really just wanted to be on the news and let everybody know, you know, hey, I'm crazy.
And the officers were serving the warrant in the immediate area, so they could
Right, right. Yes, sir.
So do you know of any areas in the country that, or proposals that are out where teachers are going to be allowed to carry?
Oh, well, there are all kinds of, yes. The short answer is yes. I grew up in Oregon, although I've lived here longer than I live there. There's no restriction in Oregon on carrying firearms in schools whatsoever, and I know for a fact, absolutely, they do. Surprisingly, I had mentioned before, California is one of those states. And so, yes, there are states where you can carry. I urge you all to go on to georgiacarry.org's website. There's a link that's called Why We Are Here. And if you click on the link, Why We Are Here, there are maps, and we try to keep it as up to date as possible, although after Arkansas repealed its church carry law, it took us a year to change them from red to yellow. But there are maps that show, generally speaking, the places Georgia has off limits and what other states do with that. You know, for example, you can click on government buildings, and it'll say green if you can carry into a government building in that state, and it'll be red if you cannot. And by design, of course, Georgia's red on every one of those maps, because those maps are aimed to show what other states do with issues that Georgia restricts. And so you can go to these schools, and there are two different links for schools. There's K through 12 and then college. And of course, most of them are red, admittedly, for K through 12, but that is not uniformly the case across the nation. I will point out one state, which you see all of the shootings and accidents and bloodshed every day, right next door in Alabama, which has no restriction on carrying in schools, college or K through 12, right? And it's just a bloodbath over there.
You mentioned school policy here in the county. Could you revisit that?
Well, yeah, I got a handbook from my child's school that asked me to sign an acknowledgement form, and I wrote a 2-page letter stating I could not and would not sign the acknowledgement form until the policy was corrected. It said that the weapon policy, it was about this long, but the gist of it was that it's unlawful. So what the policy said is unlawful to have a firearm at the school, at school property, at the school building, at the school bus, in your private vehicle, parked on school property, and then gave this big long definition of weapons. And that is not Georgia law. The letter I wrote back said you intentionally omitted the almost 20 exceptions in the law, some of which maybe they don't want in their policy because their teachers would realize they can lock a car out there. That's always been Georgia law. And so can parents, and parents who are licensed can have a firearm with them when carrying or picking up a student at a school building. That's what the law says. And so I asked them to correct that and told them I wouldn't be signing it. So, we'll see if they try to expel my child or something over it. Yes, ma'am.
Did you address that with Steve Barker?
I don't know who Steve Barker is, I'm
School
sorry.
superintendent.
Oh, no, I have not.
You have
I have not. I thought I would address it with the local school that,
Attend the next school board.
thought I would address it with the local school that sent it to me, and then find out where it came from
Yeah.
and decide what to do there. Now,
I'm sorry.
go ahead. Yes, sir.
You talk about all the various maps and things that Georgia does. If there were one universal thing, taking all those into account, a best state for gun ownership, worst state for gun ownership, where would Georgia end up in that list?
Probably in the middle. Probably in the middle. And, that's thankfully a very good change from where it used to be, which on places off limits was dead set at the bottom. And we didn't have restrictions on, for example, the types of weapons you could buy and things. But take a look at the before and after, these pamphlets I pushed out. You've got the before GCO and after GCO. And that gives you an idea of some of the restrictions that some people who ended up in handcuffs and went to jail didn't even know existed. Yes, sir.
2 examples. I go to the airport to pick up someone outside the terminal who's going to walk off the curb and into my car, and I have 3 or 4 pistols as normal in my car. Am I a violator?
You're not. In fact, you can carry your pistol into the airport. Just don't go past the metal detectors.
And keep it concealed.
You don't have to keep it concealed.
But it's best to keep it concealed.
I don't conceal mine usually. It's concealed today because I'm wearing a jacket. Yes, sir.
Which is the best state, which is the worst state? You said Georgia was in the middle.
Well, if you look at, for example, Oregon and New Hampshire, okay? Oregon and New Hampshire, I'd point next door to Alabama, but they just had a change in the law, and I haven't studied it extremely carefully. But in Oregon, you can carry into your child's elementary school, you can carry into a police station, you can carry into the Capitol building to see your representative. They don't have restrictions on what type of weapons you can own. You can carry openly without a license in both of those states, by the way. The only place off limits in New Hampshire is a courtroom. And they're both run by Democrats, and in Oregon, Democrats every year introduce a bill to ban guns in elementary schools, and every year it's defeated. So, I just caution you, look, we're in a one-party state here in Georgia. So I know I'm speaking to Republicans. I was a delegate to for the Republican Party, so please don't get upset at this, but we're a one-party state. You don't really think it's Democrats messing up these bills that are being pushed in the General Assembly, do you? So I would take a careful look. Georgia carry is strictly nonpartisan, but The D or the R does not mean that they have your interests at heart. It does not mean that they view your relationship, you as an individual, to the government in the same way that you do. And it doesn't mean that they view your right to life and your right to defend your life as a fundamental human right. Yes, ma'am?
Do you know if there's still a shortage of ammunition?
It depends on what you're trying to get. For some reason, there's still a shortage of 22, which I can't figure out. It seems like they churn those out by the thousands. But 9mm, 45, the more common ones are coming back. I'm carrying a 45 at the moment. I carry a 10mm frequently, and that's kind of hard to find at times. So it really just depends on what you're seeking. It's more expensive than it was 5 or 6 years ago, though.
We have time for about one more question, then we need to.
Yes, ma'am.
Is the government grabbing all this ammunition? Because I heard what the
Well,
it's just
you know, like it or not, we've got wars going on. And so, yes, the government is buying not just ammunition. You need to look at a couple of things. Commodities, metal. Metal is used to build ammunition. And I'm a construction lawyer for the most part. And so I see escalation in materials prices being a problem on construction projects, and metal is a big one. So that factors into it. Yes, partially, but you know, if you're looking at things from a constitutional perspective, you know, ammunition for the military probably is one of the very few things that the federal government's doing that actually is a power of government that they should be exercising. So I can't get too angry at them for that. Can I mention the lawsuit in South Carolina quickly? How many of you know you can't carry a gun in South Carolina? You do. You cannot carry a gun in South Carolina, and the reason is because you're from Georgia. That's it. I mentioned an 8-hour, huh?
really?
Really. I mentioned an 8-hour course I sat through on Sunday. It was me and 16 other Georgia Carry members. 8-hour training course is required for South Carolina. I brought 2 instructors over here to Atlanta. They taught the course to get us the training. We are applying. They will tell us no because we are not South Carolina residents and we don't own property in South Carolina. And then I'm going to sue South Carolina on denying a privilege or immunity of citizenship to a non-resident. Now, most of you probably know that, you know, a state can't deny you, for example, if you wanted to go to South Carolina and have an abortion. The courts would say you cannot deny an abortion to somebody because they're from Georgia. If you wanted to sue someone in South Carolina, they cannot deny you access to the courts. These are things courts have said are privileges and immunities of citizenship in the United States that states cannot deny to somebody based upon non-residency. Now, look through the Constitution and you tell me if you can find the words abortion or access to the courts. And yet we have a fundamental human right. We have an express constitutional protection for the right to bear arms. Now, I will tell you that this isn't the first time a lawsuit like this has been filed, but it has ramifications nationwide for you being able to carry in other states. South Carolina says the reason they won't recognize Georgia is because we don't have training as a burden on our licensing process. However, if you go to Florida and get a license where they require training and you submit your training and you get a Florida license, they'll let somebody from Florida carry on a Florida license in South Carolina, but they won't let you carry because you are from Georgia, even if you have a Florida license. So, you know, Georgia's law is easy. We'll recognize yours if you recognize ours. So all South Carolina has to do is change that. But we're intending to force it through the courts. There was a case before Heller and McDonald, the Supreme Court cases that said no, the Second Amendment's not about membership in a militia, it's about individual rights, where a Navy SEAL in Virginia who was a dutiful son and would go visit his mom in New York applied for a non-resident New York license to carry. Navy SEAL. Okay, you know, no training or safety issues with a Navy SEAL, I should hope. And the state of New York turned him down. He sued on the privileges or immunities clause. By the way, I'm not talking about the 14th Amendment. I'm talking about the original Constitution before any amendments were ever added. It's Article 4, Section 4. Go take a look. A state cannot deny a privilege or immunity of citizenship to a non-resident. And he sued under that basis, and the Second Circuit, which is the Federal Court of Appeals just below the Supreme Court, after he lost in the federal court in New York, took a look at it and they said, hey, you know, this is a really good argument. but unfortunately there's no right to bear arms. That's a right for militia only. Although the guy was a Navy SEAL, I don't know how much more militia you need to get. And so they turned him down. So, but I found it interesting that even the Second Circuit up in New York was taking a look at this and said, you know, if the situation was different, if there was some right to bear arms that existed, then this would be a really good argument. So we're going to find that out in South Carolina. And by the way, I intend to sue Georgia on the same basis. Georgia doesn't issue to non-residents either. And so there are some states that can't really carry here in Georgia. And if you come from Vermont, Vermont doesn't have a license to carry. It's legal to conceal or openly in Vermont without any license whatsoever. So I think every state should allow a non-resident who visits there the ability to carry. Yes, ma'am?
What if you're traveling cross country through several states and you've got a gun that you carry?
Well, I suggest you check the state laws very carefully that you travel through because you could very well. Brian Aiken is a guy I talked to on the radio last week, and he spent time in a New Jersey prison for having guns packed in his car and hollow point ammunition. Hollow points, who would carry a gun without hollow points? But in New Jersey, that's a felony. He packed them in his car exactly like the state police told him to when he called them. He went to New Jersey state prison. Chris Christie commuted his sentence, did not pardon him. Remember that because he's probably going to be a Republican nominee. This guy did not pardon this guy, just commuted his sentence. He's still a convicted felon. The family law court said, we don't need immoral, evil people like you seeing their children, because he was going through a divorce with his wife. He hasn't seen his son in 4 years, not even supervised visitation. That's how dangerous a person is who dares to have a gun and hollow point ammunition in his car in that state is. So be careful when you travel in other states. There is a federal law that is supposed to protect you if you're passing through a state like that, if you pack it away separate from the ammunition in your trunk. But I would just say be very, very careful. About half the states recognize Georgia's license, so just take a look and see if you have a license here. There are about half of the states that allow you to carry there just as if your Georgia license was one of their licenses.